a long journey, but this is a summary in part of the research which I conducted, and some of the elements of that research. And it's about obviously international students in Irish universities and understanding the role of agency within a linguistic imperial policy setting, I suppose, is a better way of putting it than higher education system. Just to begin with just to give a little bit of background, I'll talk about the research, I'll talk about the setting and the background, and move forward to the findings and analysis. So I'd like to reflect a lot on the role of the researcher within this, because it turns out that my own researcher agency was an integral element within this project, and it's quite important to my actual research. And then final thing is just to tie it up by discussing the methodology and why it kind of matters in this particular section, in this particular case, in relation to the actual research I carried out and the research I carried out and my own role as a yes, okay. Irish higher education, I want to bring you back to about 2008, 2009. Around that time, Ireland was crushed by a massive financial, what was called the global economic crisis, and Ireland was hit by huge financial restrictions. Around the time, the competitiveness of global education was recognized as a way of enhancing higher education, because through greater numbers of students coming in, fee-paying students in particular. In 2010, Ireland was obviously forced to accept this financial stewardship, one of the biggest problems was huge cuts to higher education, the government at the time looked for effective ways to reinforce that sector. These hits especially hit academics and people working in the area of pensions. But also the problem, I suppose, was while the higher education system was being reduced in financial efficacy, or efficacy because of the financial restrictions, education is usually connected with rebuilding the economy, right? Especially when it's supported by the government. I have a couple of questions just before we move into it. What features of Irish higher education stood out against competitors in a global environment in terms of this role of economic, in terms of this internationalization, and how were Irish universities and colleges perceived in relation to the countries? Just to think about that moving forward, we've got the Irish government proceeded to launch two strategies, one in 2010 and another in 2016. While there are a range of advantages in there, such as enhancing the profile and attracting more students for research and building this sustainable model for growth, and a brand for Irish education, essentially the main goal was to attract more fee-paying students as a key component within this setting. To give you an idea, just because there's more students they weren't just international students, it's not very clear on side, but the red is the number of Irish students increasing between 2010 and 2019, and the blue is the international students. So even though there are more international students, there's also more Irish students, so the system is filling up. So it's not necessarily, and the system is not necessarily that the places are not necessarily expanding. And even though there's more students, from a policy perspective, the higher education sector is not necessarily performing well on global tables. And this would be from a government perspective, in terms of the status of higher education in terms of promoting the state system. All right. Sorry, we can't read that so well. I don't like to read it out. So this is just one of my researcher notes. As a practitioner, I knew that something was amiss. I could call it a hunch if you want, but it was an informed hunch based on working with international students, so that is what I did. They were students, but from around the world, and I struggled to see how policies were taking students' needs into consideration. This struck me as wrong, and as an educator, it struck me for its lack of empathy and understanding. When I followed my hunch in terms of analysing the policy, for example, it was clear that the policies were not informed by much research, and especially very little from Ireland. Typically, they were focused on, they looked to a lot of OECD research and also some sources from Australia. I forgot to mention, a large part of what was driving me here was my own practitioner position. And at this point, I'd like us to take a little kind of laugh at this image here which pops up when we mention internationalization, because if we're familiar with internationalization, typically those like fancy blue lights, they don't really go around the world, they go in one direction away. I try to look at international here as both a process and a reaction. The process is in terms of making something more international, be that a system, or also it could be students perceiving themselves as more international also. Or it could be the teaching or the curriculum, for example, right? But also it's a reaction, and the reaction is the response to help or to amend something. And I draw a lot of this from thinking about what Alpert was saying about globalization as well. It's connected with that you know, internationalization is this reaction to globalizing forces, and Irish higher education is reacting to globalizing forces by bringing in a policy to attract more students. And this is essentially the key focus was to attract more students without really giving it much critical appraisal. As well, the other thing is a lot of Irish higher education, the policy was very seriously focused on the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia, which means that these are the English-speaking states, nations, very market-focused, quite elitist and prejudicial in terms of targeting countries and saying we want to get students from these countries because they're fee-paying, and they were very much branding Ireland as an English-speaking with a white face. So a few things about Ireland before I go into it, as there are some factors which we're talking about being an EU member, small, has a good focus on FDE and is quite dynamic, but the main thing is it's an English-speaking country, and Ireland was actually focusing on this as a way of attracting students. So I try to think about this and try to frame this and try to get an idea of what this could look like, right? And I looked at Phillipson when he talks about linguistic imperialism, in terms of linguistic imperialism is typically related to English being used as a force to control. In terms of Ireland, it's a smaller country. It has a background of actually not being an English-speaking country, which makes it unique, which makes it very unique. Neelam Aglarad on Béla before. Sorry, that's my Irish. But Irish is actually one of our shared languages, and it wasn't up until about the middle of the 19th century that we spoke English widely. In terms of Phillipson, what Phillipson talks about when building a linguistic imperialist structure, he talks about having a project, a product, and a process, whereby the process will be perhaps the policy, the project will be to make Irish higher education more international, and the product will be Ireland, or the universities or the degrees. However, it's neglecting something. And I kind of think about it as the people. It's not really considering whether people, in this case, the students, that will be attracted into this and that can make this work. This was where I was thinking about in terms of this, trying to understand this policy and trying to frame it and understand it from the impacts of attracting students. Again, going back to my my notes as I kind of went through this, for the extent to which linguistic imperialism determines Irish higher education policy has been a significant motivator for some time. The concern rests with Ireland's status as an English-speaking country, but also its background of a country which adapted to English as almost a survival mechanism. Despite this, little attention paid to this phenomenon makes Ireland unique among English-speaking countries. But it didn't necessarily address what it meant for students to study in Ireland. And this is something, as a practitioner, that I could not connect the two as I began to research. As you're attracting students, how do you connect them? So my research evaluated the experiences of Chinese students in Irish universities. It was a small enough scale, 12 postgraduates and undergraduates from 2 universities within the greater Dublin area, with a couple of interviews, and also impacted by COVID-19. I don't want to dwell too much on the methods necessarily here, because it's the outcomes and the results which are important. But the thematic analysis uncovered that there were a few key elements there. Students were looking at their experiences, being a Chinese student, the role of the university, social networks, and career benefits came up within their questions. And again, as I read through the research project, I asked myself, how does this stand out? The simple sample size of the students was small, but the significance and quality is high. There are many other areas that could be addressed. But what I've not mentioned is that I started collecting data March 2020, speaking to a quite marginalized group of students. And personally, my life changed week by week with the project because of COVID-19, because of the moving country. And as such, my lived experience are a key component of this doctorate, because they drove me on, and I was able to feel the empathy to relate with these students and to feel that there was a greater need to explore this project and this research. What I should say about the marginalized nature of the Chinese students in Korea, I know in the UK that there is a very large population of Chinese students in the UK, but in Ireland, Chinese students are actually quite a small population. The largest population of international students in Ireland are from the United States, followed by Erasmus students from Europe. And then Middle Eastern Chinese students have increased in recent years. So in terms of being international students, they are one of the larger visible populations. But in terms of other than that, most of the largest populations are typically white, Western looking, who may not relate. My analysis, this relationship between the teams, essentially provided an understanding that what I have here is 5 particular teams which are interconnected. None of them exist on their own. Absolutely none of them exist on their own. It's kind of small, but you cannot, for example, be a Chinese student in Ireland without considering the way that you build your social networks, right? Or for example, your career benefits are directly related to the role of your university and how they help you out. And these patterns that came out, they're really important for kind of getting an understanding of what I was talking about, and how the students were flourishing or not, because there were different situations whereby different factors might, I suppose, impede their development. Agency featured as a defining feature across all of this. And I think of agency in terms of Vaughan. We talk about dispositional, positional, and motivational. Vaughan doesn't specifically speak about international students, but because there's no background to evaluating or discussing international students in Ireland, this particular, in terms of agency, and very limited in terms of a specific population such as Chinese students, and I would be willing to say there is no other analysis of Chinese students in this setting in terms of a a study like mine. The dispositional, positional, motivational agency were integral. Agency was seen as a response by students to their various settings. But also what we saw in the agency is that students, they're self-dependent adults, right? They're rarely, typically looked as deficient in terms of Irish research. They look at the problems, I think you're familiar with that. But this completely turned it around and questioned all of that. They are, all of the situations they encountered, and I'll talk about a few of them in a minute. What I found about it was just in journeying overseas to seek an education, all of the students, they wanted to be different in their own way, not in a shared way. They had their own way of wanting to be different. And I wouldn't suggest or define what they considered as how different could be defined. They defined that difference themselves. Marginalism is worth thinking about here because, you know, all international students cross the border to become different, whether through learning, through graduating with a degree, through immersion in a linguistic setting, or simply growing up. This is the kind of person they want to become. They don't really fully imagine it before it, and some respond to change only when they must. Many let it happen, others run to it. And I really feel this from my own perspective, because I also, you know, traveled to the other side of the world, to Korea, in the middle of COVID, and tried to complete my own dissertation and doctorate, unaware what the future was. And I really connected with the idea of this and recognized that my own agency in this was an integral and important element to understand what the students were talking about. And when I say this, I speak out to people who are doing their own research at the moment, maybe postdocs or fellow PhD students. You know, celebrate your own agency. Believe in yourself. You will make the difference. At the end of the day, we rely on ourselves a lot of the time. Not all the time, obviously. Just to analyze some of the areas which emerged through the agency, we talked about three key areas which came up through independence, transfer of experience, and belonging. We could recognize independence in terms of seeking opportunities behind the classroom, willingness to learn from being alone, you know, going out to achieve their own goals. One particular student started volunteering with a church and started helping homeless people because that's he believed what he wanted to, that's what he believed was important for his experience, which he couldn't achieve elsewhere. Other students, you know, joined many clubs trying to build a profile, while other students kind of sat back, waiting for things to happen. But the experiences, they brought the challenges, and their agency responded to this. And this was something which was really standing out. The transfer of experience of students acting beyond their qualification. Learning and assessment weren't impediments, believe it or not, unlike what people might consider as typical impediments with international students. The students saw the bigger picture. They didn't see the chart, for example, of various grades. In terms of belonging, I think one of the let's look at the bottom, student experience measurements lack accuracy and focus. In terms of Ireland, the way they measure it is in terms of student experience survey, which doesn't even address international students directly, but there are not many in Ireland. That's irrelevant, really. Elements such as friendships had positive impacts, but the way those friendships formed in terms of different departments, some students were empowered within their departments, other students felt ignored and left behind. The students who felt that they were not being ignored behind, they felt their agency diminished because they weren't being empowered and encouraged to achieve their success. Okay. But ultimately, all the students, they were proud to be students, and they acted accordingly. And I think this was something that really stood out with the students. They were really proud to be a student in their respective university, and they viewed themselves, and I think that in terms of when we think about students, that's really important, even from my own perspective, right? Okay. So reflecting the methodology, I wanted to really talk about the value in discussing, exploring, and learning encountered through the incidents and actions encountered as a student. They provide a rich and intimate record that is unexplored in Ireland. The outlooks, they reflect on the epistemological and ontological focus of the research. The students and the researcher are guided by the experiences and the expectations. And this is something that's was integral when I was doing my interviews and talking and working with students, that it wasn't this, I read as I kind of finalized my dissertation that this met the hallmarks of a grounded study, but it wasn't a grounded study because it wasn't intentional. It emerged as this from something that this area needed to be explored and questions needed to be asked. My methods, in terms of why is it necessary to approach it this way, my methods were employed to learn and uncover factors which were unknown. And in terms of a record in Ireland, this record is not really explored. My ontological, epistemological focus presented new values and realities and a perspective from international students. Essentially, what I wanted to do, and I think what I did, was to give them a voice within the wider Irish sector, and this is not allow the students to define their own voice. And I think that this was the key result. Just to conclude with my final kind of researcher note, the research started out by simply trying to know more about how students from overseas got on. I think when we go there, how do students get on? How do they, if someone goes home, how are you doing? How did you get on? Rather than saying, was it good, was it bad? Tell me about your experience, your story. The value of the research rests in the methodology, as this is how the results were obtained. The way the research was in itself an exploration of what was possible and what could be learned. And as a practitioner, and I think I was driven constantly by I worked with international students for many years just teaching. I just knew that this would give the students a voice, because you talk to students and they don't tell you what the policy is saying. I'll finish, sorry. 2 more lines. Okay. Without conducting research in this way, it's not possible to know what may have been covered. And importantly, and this is a line from one of my students can be shown as who they are and not as a single collective marching in unison, which was how students